This evening goes to tonight's event sponsor, Skylark Bookshop in Columbia, Missouri. We're very grateful to them for their support over the years. Tonight, one person who asks our featured speaker a question will receive a copy of one of Mike's novels, courtesy of Skylark Bookshop. So if you have any questions for Michael as the event proceeds, please type them into the comments and I will ask him at the end of the event. Then at the end of that Q&A, I will announce the winner. Please remember that if you miss an event, everything is available on YouTube and Facebook for viewing or reviewing. If you haven't already, please do take a moment to review the whole schedule, all 3 months of it, on our website and plan to attend as many events as you like. While you're there, you can also sign up for the festival newsletter, which goes out on Monday mornings and will keep you up to date with what to expect each week. And please tell your friends about the festival. Now, please welcome author and writing teacher extraordinaire, Michael Cardos.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thanks to Fong, and thanks to everybody working for this Unbound conference, which is such a great lineup this year and every year. Also, I lived in Columbia, Missouri for 4 years in grad school, and it was such a great 4 years, and I miss it. I would love to be there, but I'm glad to be here, which is almost like being there. I just want to say a couple quick things before we start. We have a lot to cram into about 30 minutes or 35 minutes, and then I can't wait to hear what questions people might have. But I do encourage you to ask questions. And also, I'd like to start off as we get going just by asking a question that you can type into the comments, which goes like this. When you think about suspense, what words come to mind? And I would love, as we're going over the next few minutes, to just hear some of those words that come to mind that we can incorporate into what we're talking about. I want to start off by making a proclamation that we can't shake our early experiences and our early exposures. And growing up in New Jersey, the books, I kept thinking about the first books that I loved and how they happened to be suspenseful. Even though, remember that old one with Grover the monster at the end of this book, where Grover's like freaked out that there's going to be a monster there, and you turn and you realize at the end that he's the monster. The only writer I knew before the age of 30 was this woman who lived on the corner in a neighborhood that was filled with dentists and doctors and lawyers and things like that. This woman was a writer, and she wrote children's books. And her first book, I think it was her first book, was called The Treasure Trap, about these 2 kids who go into this old haunted house to find some treasure. It was just this amazingly thrilling book, and I loved it. And I never knew that actual humans wrote books until I read that book, and suddenly I knew that this woman at the end of the block wrote it, and it was sort of my first introduction into a writer. And I think I was about 12 years old, and then another 20 years had to go by before I met another writer. A Wrinkle in Time was a favorite book of mine. And these are, it's random and unexplainable and mysterious, the books that happen to end up in our hands and that we fall in love with early on. My mother was a high school English teacher, so she was pretty eclectic in her reading interests, and so we always had different kinds of books in the house. But I was always drawn to thrillers, to suspenseful books, and it was something that after college, I really decided I wanted to write a novel. I think I took 2 English classes in college. I was a music major, and I played the drums, and that's what I did for a long time. But I always loved reading, and I wanted to try to write a thriller, and I wrote a really bad thriller in my 20s. I mean, it was bad. But I finished this bad thriller, a draft of it anyway, and put it aside. And I went back to grad school and then wrote all kinds of different things, and was exposed to different kinds of authors. And then I accidentally wrote and published a thriller. I didn't mean to. To me, it was always just a novel. But what happened was it was a story that first appeared in a newspaper in Washington, D.C. when I was in grad school, about this bus driver who was, I think he had just broken up with his girlfriend, and he was really upset, and he's driving these kids home on the bus. And he is so freaked out and so worried about his relationship that he accidentally misses one of the stops. And then he gets really worried about getting in trouble. He's afraid that the principal is going to fire him or something. And he becomes so worried about that that he blows past the next stop. And then he blows past the next stop. And after 3 or 4 missed stops, he realizes that he's kind of hijacked his own school bus. And I thought that was awesome. So I stopped reading this article immediately because I didn't want to know what happened. I wanted to just let that sit with me for a while and think, boy, if that were my character, what would he do? And what would be the situation? And how would he handle it? And so I wrote that story, which became the title story of my collection of stories. But even when I was done with that, this idea of a guy who is not bad, but circumstances are that he gets hit with a situation while he's driving, and his failure to make a really ethical, quick decision immediately leads him into lots and lots of trouble. Okay, so this sort of idea of an accidental hijacking or an accidental kidnapping, I thought was just really fun to play with. And so that became my first novel. Now, tonight, we're not going to talk a ton about genre. Okay. But I think it's worth noting that genre matters to a lot of people, and it matters to publishers, and it matters to agents, and it matters to some readers who, who like certain kinds of books. They like mysteries, they like thrillers, they like whatever it is. And so when I wrote that novel, The 3-Day Affair, I never really considered it in a particular genre. And yet, when it was time to send it out to publishers, my agent had to make very conscious decisions about, is this going to literary publishers? Is this going to crime imprints and things like that? And so I sort of was introduced to this whole world of genre and this whole world of, of which publishers handle which kind of books. And so when it got put out, it got put out basically as a thriller, which means the font on the cover is really big. And but that was really interesting to me, that readers come to books because they read thrillers, or because they read mysteries, or because they read literary fiction, or whatever it is. But to me, it was just an interesting story stemming from a what if question. Okay, it is a question that ignited my imagination. And I think that my second and third novels also then became sort of suspensey, crime-ish novels. And I thought a lot about why that is. And I think it's because crime fiction, and I'm saying crime fiction because it's sort of an umbrella term, has something to do with the stakes being so high. So as you might have characters who lead fairly ordinary lives, and these aren't, spy novels or detective novels or cop novels, but so these are characters that I write about who lead fairly ordinary lives, but suddenly they're in the midst of something that's a lot bigger than anything they've experienced before. Okay, and that's probably true of all novels, right? All novels are about the day that's bigger and more important than other days. But I think a crime novel is by definition concerned with life, like in the extreme moments where the comforts and reassurance and self-delusions get stripped away, right? And characters have to act. They have to reveal who they are at their deepest selves. And I think sometimes when I talk to my students, I always talk about Flannery O'Connor, who talks about violence in fiction as being strangely capable of returning characters to reality. And think about like the misfit in the story, Good Man is Hard to Find, where, she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life, right? This idea that only when facing this extreme moment of her life, she becomes truthful and she understands things, right? And she has her moment of grace, right? So I think sometimes that happens in crime too. Crime is capable of returning characters to reality, right? Because the people who are connected to crimes are usually desperate for something, right? Either to get away with what they did, or to solve the crime, or to recover from it, or to seek retribution or justice or understanding, right? And of course, all this falls flat without suspense, right? You can't have a thriller that's not suspenseful. Okay. But suspense, and this is why I kind of wanted to talk about this tonight, is a very hard word and topic to pin down. And we don't always have the right language to discuss it, right? There's certain things that we might associate with suspense. If you happen to know what a Macguffin is, that's a Hitchcock-developed term. This idea of characters going after something, wanting something that's important to them. It's a device used in movies and in fiction. You think about that briefcase in the movie Pulp Fiction that we never even learn what's in it, right? But all the characters are going crazy trying to get to it. The idea of like ticking bombs, or ticking clocks. Think about The Wizard of Oz, right? When the witch turns the hourglass upside down, and we know when that sand reaches the bottom, Dorothy's going to die, right? And so I just saw Star Wars with my kids for the first time. I mean, I'd seen it, but they hadn't seen it, and I was amazed at how many. There must be 10 different instances of ticking bombs in that, movie. And I think that these sometimes are relegated to the idea of being like cheap tricks, but I do think they have their place. And there are any number of, super literary works that use their ticking bombs or ticking clocks. But I do think that suspense is a vital ingredient in all kinds of fiction in ways that move beyond things like the Macguffin, okay, and things like the ticking bomb. And that's kind of what I want to get into. Things that where we can work suspense into all kinds of fiction to make the work itself more compelling. Okay, so I want to think about this. A lot of times, the first level reading of things we like, we just want to know what's going to happen, right? What's going to happen next? How will they get out of this predicament? And this is sort of surface level suspense or surface level storytelling, and it's important, right? But there are some deeper things, and we're not going to care what happens next if we don't care about the characters, right? So a lot of this boils down to how do we create characters that we actually care about enough to care about what happens next to them, or to care if they're in trouble that they get out of it, okay? And one thing I do, and I brought my handy dandy whiteboard for this, is just thinking about, I'm going to write 2 words on this board. It's my simplified exercise, okay? I'm going to write dreams and dreads. Let's see if, I don't know if you can see it or not, but my dream dread chalkboard, okay? And it goes like this. Our characters, all of them, have dreams and they have dreads, okay? They also have hopes and expectations and things like that. But stories that I think are really compelling and that are suspenseful tend to be operating in the worlds of dreams and dreads, okay? And the example I'd like to give goes like this. You have a guy who plays football in high school, okay? Maybe he is really good at it. And what does he do? He plays football in college. Ooh, now he's getting really good, right? Football in college, you're really good. Now, what is his dream? Let's say his dream is to play in the NFL. It's a reasonable dream, right? What is his dread? His dread is not the absence of playing in the NFL, like almost making it but getting cut, okay? His dread is something different, okay? His dread is not only not getting into the NFL, but it's finding himself back in his lousy, tiny hometown, being the assistant coach for his high school team. And he goes to the bar on Friday nights, and people come up to him and like, oh man, that field goal you kicked back when you were 17 was so cool. And like, now he's 38, and the best moment of his life is 20 years behind him. You know what I mean? Like, that's the dread. And so a character who's facing that dream versus that dread becomes the kind of compelling character that we really care about what happens to him. Okay? So then in terms of plot, if you come up with a situation that threatens and dangles, it like dangles the dream and threatens the dread, okay, we're going to really become invested in what happens, and that's going to create some suspense. Okay? So I'm going to talk about some other things, but I think a lot of that is rooted in this idea that we've got to come up with characters that really want things badly. I mean, everybody talks about that, right? Kurt Vonnegut said every character needs something, even if it's only a glass of water. Robert Olen Butler talks about a character's yearning. Everybody's got their way of talking about it, right? But I think this idea of characters wanting something deeply and really caring about it, caring about the outcome of their own story, and having the corresponding dread. Okay, what happens if they don't achieve it? Okay, so keep that in your mind while we go from here. Now, one way to create suspense is to state the outcome. Okay, say it ahead of time. Okay, so the reader reads then not for what happens, but how it happens and why it happens. Okay. And again, that only matters if we care about the characters. But, that's one of the hardest things to do. But let's think about this. Lucy holds the football for Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown goes, "This time I'm going to kick it to the moon." We know he's not going to do it, right? But it's still suspenseful. He's running. We're watching, right? We're watching him run because we don't know exactly what she's going to pull it away this time and how high he's going to go and if his clothes are going to pop off and what he's going to say and what she's going to say, right? Even though we know it's going to happen, it's still suspenseful. If I were to start a story that goes like this: the class fishing trip in the 3rd grade, when I hooked my best friend Andrew in the neck, began quietly enough. Well, you know what's going to happen at the climax of that story, right? I'm going to hook my friend Andrew in the neck fishing, okay? But you're going to be interested in how we get there and what happens, okay? One of my favorite all-time plot moves is Jonathan Letham's novel Motherless Brooklyn, where you have a detective with Tourette's, okay? And so he's always shouting out obscenities and things. And the plot is constructed in such a way that the key piece of information he needs is in a monastery where everyone's taken a vow of silence. And so he's sitting around unable to say anything around other people, and it's just the most silent place in the world. And he's going to blow it. He's just going to shout out the most vile things possible. And it's so wonderfully suspenseful, okay? Now, this kind of touches on another thing, okay? So if we're going to create bullet points, because bullet points are good, right? So one thing is to suggest or imply or just say what the outcome's going to be, okay? Here's another one. Delay, 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 okay? Delay the outcome, even if we know what it's going to be. And that is just such, there's not a lot of tricks in writing, but boy, is that one. That's a really good one. And so there's this classic writing exercise that goes like this. A character is about to discover a body in the woods. Write the paragraph that precedes the discovery of the body. And I love that exercise because it's all about delay and about mood setting and about preparing the reader for something and about doing the opposite of rushing, okay? So one writer might write a few sentences that are very atmospheric, the physical world of the woods. Someone else might put in a quick memory. Someone else might put in a bit of introspection. Somebody writes. There's different ways to handle that, but the writer's job there is to create the paragraph that comes right before the discovery of a body. Okay. One of my all-time favorite bits of delay, which creates suspense and prolongs suspense, comes from the movie Rocky, the original movie Rocky, and it's so good that I'm going to read you that scene. It's just to set it up. If you've seen Rocky or if you haven't, Rocky is this good fighter that's kind of a mess, and but he gets the chance to fight Apollo Creed, for the heavyweight championship. And he does that whole training montage, and he gets better and better, and it's all dun, 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 and he's getting ready, and he's been trained. And what happens is the day before the fight, that night he goes to the arena and it's totally empty, and he looks at this arena where he's going to be the next day, and he knows it's going to be full of people and everything. And it would be so easy to go to the fight, to the climactic fight that we've all been waiting for. But that's not what happens. What happens is he goes home. He's been out all night walking the streets and everything, and he goes home and he goes into his apartment, and Adrian, his girlfriend, is there. And I'm going to read it to you. He goes into his apartment, and Adrian is asleep on the couch. And he lowers himself beside her, her eyes open, and he says, "Can't do it." I can't do my Philadelphia accent that well, but he says, "Can't do it." And she says, "What?" "I can't beat him." "Apollo?" "Yeah, I can't beat him. I've been watching the movies, studying. He ain't weak nowhere." And then I love what she says. It's one of my favorite lines. It would be so tempting to write in like, "Oh, sure you can, Rocky, you can do it." Instead, so he says, I've been watching the movies, studying, he ain't weak nowhere. And she says, what are we going to do? He said, I don't know. Oh, Rocky, you work so hard. And then he says, it ain't so bad because I was a nothing before. Don't say that. Come on, it's true. But that don't bother me. I just want to prove something. I ain't no bum. It don't matter if I lose. Don't matter if he opens my head. The only thing I want to do is go the distance. That's all. Nobody's ever gone 15 rounds with Creed. If I go them 15 rounds and that bell rings and I'm still standing, I'm going to know then I weren't just another bum from the neighborhood. Oh, and I love that so much. It's so great because it delays the climactic scene. It reminds us what the stakes are, and it shifts them a little bit. It fine-tunes his goal from like being a winner to defining what winning means for him, which is not winning the fight, it's lasting the fight. And that whole thing when she's like, what are we going to do, cements their relationship, right? Because she believes him. He says, I can't win. And she's like, oh my gosh, she believes him. She's not going to argue with him. What are we going to do? And suddenly it's we. It's just a beautiful scene. And so I kind of, when I wrote my novel Bluff, which is my most recent novel, I did a very similar thing. I think of that novel a bit as a Rocky story, and it's all, the final scene is a poker game, okay, where the main character and this professional card cheat are going to try to scam this high stakes poker game out of $1.5 million, and they've been working and working and working, training Rocky style. And the night before, she doesn't know if she can do it or not. And so she happens to have an upstairs neighbor, and she goes up to this upstairs neighbor that she's not really close with, but she's another person living in the building. And she basically says, you know, I've got to do this thing, but I don't think I can do it. And it had this real quiet domestic scene before the big event. And it totally came from Rocky. I just loved the way that scene is paced and what it does emotionally. So to me, that's, you don't have suspense unless you have those quiet moments that tee up the real big scenes. Okay, so I just love that so much. Okay, new bullet point. Okay, here's a new bullet point. I think suspense is an intensified version of all fiction writing, where you've got to balance what to reveal and what to withhold. And that's, like, I think one of the hardest things about writing fiction is knowing what to reveal and when to reveal it and what to withhold. You can't say everything first, right? You've got to order events for the reader. And so I'm always thinking about that. But so here's the technique for suspense, okay? Immediate needs and desires, reveal those, but withhold the deeper implications and motivations. So I want to give you an example of this from my novel Before He Finds Her, which is my second novel, where the novel is told from 2 point of view characters, and one of them, his first chapter is chapter 2. This is the first time we meet him, and he is a long haul truck driver. He has his own 18-wheeler, and when his section opens, he is rushing, ticking bomb, right, ticking clock. He's rushing to get to the place that sold him his truck. Okay, and so those first couple of pages, all we know is he's got to get there before they close. And so he's hurrying to get there before they close. And then once he gets there, we learn from his interaction there that the reason he had to get there was because he wants to sell his truck. He has to sell his truck immediately. And he knows that the guy who sold him the truck will be willing to buy it back, although for a very cheap price. He'll pay him the cash, right? And so then we learn that he's got to sell the truck, and he's willing to take far less than it's worth if he can get cash now. He's got to have the money right now, okay? And so that's his immediate need. Oh, we know he needs the cash right now. And of course, by revealing the information that he needs the cash right now, it raises the question, why does he need the cash right now? Okay, so the idea here is that you're revealing information, but you're also planting questions in the reader's mind. Okay, so why does he need the cash? Well, he needs the cash. Oh, and by the way, why is he selling his truck? That's his livelihood, right? So it's something important, okay? Turns out he needs the cash so he can throw an enormous block party with his own money, even though he hates all of his neighbors on the block. Okay, so now we know it's crucially important, wise to have a lot of money, because he's going to throw this neighborhood-wide huge block party himself. and he's got to have cash to do it. Okay, why on earth does he want to do that? Okay, and then a little while later, we learn, well, the reason he wants to do that is because he's been playing in this garage band for a couple of years, and he wants to feature his own band on the bandstand. He wants to perform publicly. Oh, and by the way, he's convinced the world is going to end cataclysmically. And so he wants to have this like going out of business sale for Earth. Like he wants to basically, right before the apocalypse, he wants to have this giant rock show and feature his band. Okay, now that would be a weird thing to say right up front. We kind of got to get to know him and his way of thinking and everything. And so the way that the suspense, I hope, is created is that he's not thinking about the larger things. He's thinking, I got to get to here before it closes. Got to get the cash, right? So it feels, to me, it feels like fair play psychologically because I'm revealing what he's thinking about when he's thinking about it. Okay, he's not thinking about everything. He's laser focused on the next part of the chain. Okay, and so by revealing the immediate information, but withholding the sort of deeper implications for a while, it's a way to create suspense that feels psychologically true and invests us in the character's point of view and way of thinking. Okay, and that is something that I think if you start looking at a lot of beginnings of stories and novels that you find suspenseful happens, which is to say, it feels like and it looks like the writer is revealing information, but what they're really doing is planting questions. Okay. And I guess I have one last related bullet point that I want to get to, which is something that I thought about more and more writing Bluff, because Bluff, the main character, is a magician, and she hooks up with a con artist, a poker cheat. And so I did a pretty deep dive into those things. And I thought for a while that when writing fiction has to kind of be like doing magic, right? I did magic as a teenager, and this idea of creating mysteries and doing misdirection and things. And there's this essay that Tim O'Brien wrote called The Magic Show, which I always liked. And he has this quote that says, "What appealed to me about this hobby was the abiding mystery at its heart. Mystery everywhere, permeating mystery even in the most ordinary objects of the world." And so I started to write an essay once about how writing fiction was like doing magic. But it only felt partially true. And then working on Bluff, I started to change my feelings about it and said, yeah, that sounds all well and good, but I think in a way, writing fiction bears just as close and maybe a closer relationship to the con artist, which is not to say that we're con artists, but to say that there is something about that, because when you're doing cons, the stakes are a lot higher. Okay, the con artist fails, right? That's a real problem. Okay, if a magician messes up a trick, people won't clap, they might not tip. If a con artist or a card cheat messes up, they could end up at the bottom of the lake, right? So the stakes are a lot higher. And what could be higher for an author than the reader putting the book down or the story down? Okay, so the con artist has to draw in the mark and then has to unfold the con in such a way that the mark stays invested. Okay, the con artist has to reveal information at precisely the right time, not too much, not too little, where small mysteries give way to larger and more intriguing ones. Okay, so if you're not familiar with the term the big con, okay, yes, it means that the con is larger, but really what a big con is, it means that unlike a grift where you take somebody's money that they happen to have on them, a big con means you fool them to the point where they go home, they go away, and they get all their money and they come back. Okay, so the mark initially wins some token amount before being sent away, full of excitement for much, much more money, maybe their life savings, which of course gets taken from them. Okay, that's how the sting works. There's a book called The Big Con that Paper Moon and the Sting both drew from. Okay, and that's where all this terminology got introduced. So, but to send a mark away and have them willingly return with gobs of cash requires an incredible amount of trust to be developed quickly between the con artist and the mark. Right? The mark has to return willingly, motivated by his own greed, believing he's hit upon this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Okay, and whether the con artist or the writer succeeds depends on her ability or his ability to tell a convincing story. That's why I think that the novelists or the story writer's tactics are not so different from the con artists, right? Both have to provide an intriguing premise, supply just the right kind and amount of information to simultaneously satisfy and entice, right? You're giving information and planting seeds and planting questions, overcoming resistance, and above all, eliciting trust. So the end of the first chapter in a novel is kind of like that all-important moment in the big con, this obligatory pause that asks, come back for more, okay? And if readers feel like they're winning, as if they can't lose, they'll come back, ready to invest everything they have because, and here's my catchy last line, because the suspense will be killing them. So this is kind of what, that's sort of the crux of my prepared remarks. But I would love to hear if people have questions. I would love to hear some of these suspense words if you have them. And I would love to circle back on any of those points. I mean, I sort of bullet pointed some various things. Oh my gosh, I've got a question here. Anticipation. Oh, here's some words. Surprises. Mystery thriller. Nail biting. Yeah, nail biting's good. Edge of you. Cliffhanging. Cliffhangers. It's so funny. I feel like I've been told often, oh, cliffhangers are so cheap, right? Who ends a chapter with a cliffhanger? And the answer, every kid's book in the world, right? I've got a 9-year-old. Sorry, he was 9 at one point, a 10-year-old. And, you know, he's getting to an age where there's so many amazingly great books for him. And he burns through like a 500-page book in a day. And these cliffhanger chapter endings are really good. And like, I'm reading them along with him, like, no, we can't go to bed. We have to find out what happens next. And I just don't want to downplay. I don't want to pass it off as a cheap trick because sometimes a cliffhanger is really satisfying. You know, you want to read what happens next. Let's see, what else do we got here for terms? Element of surprise. Yeah, so surprise is interesting because it's got to be surprising, but also inevitable in retrospect. I mean, you can always surprise somebody. Man walks down the street, a piano drops on their head. I mean, it's surprising, right? But it's not inevitable. So to me, that's always the hardest part of figuring out a storyline, this idea that it's got to be surprising, but inevitable, which means that for me, it never feels like I'm inventing a plot point. It feels like I uncover it or discover it. And I know when it's right and I know when it's wrong. And if I feel like I'm inventing it, I know it's wrong. But it's a subtle thing. Let's see. Thank you, George, for that nice comment. If you have multiple valves of suspense going on at once, how you prioritize which of these to release and in what order? Is that something you determine by feel, or is there a particular logic to it? Gosh, thanks. Okay, let me answer this 2 ways. One, I think about, there was a piece that George Saunders wrote for The Atlantic about revision, and I loved his emphasis that at a certain point, you don't want to take the mystery away from the writer, which is to say, writing can be learned, and there are a million craft things, but also it's weird and mysterious and hard and crazy, and I don't know. And every time I think I know something, I doubt myself. And so there is a sort of a mystery to the whole enterprise. Okay, at the same time, there are things that could really help. And this question of what do you prioritize and in what order, to be honest, I got a lot of use out of screenwriting books for novel writing. Not that I'm going into deep dive of screenplay format or anything like that, but there are a lot of books that just talk about this basic like 3-act structure, which, you know, Aristotle did that too in the Poetics, which is to say beginning, middle, end. Okay, but in terms of structure, sometimes screenwriting books I found are a little bit more useful to me than even fiction writing books at these larger structural issues, because screenplays are so the structure of them is so important that as writing novels, sometimes it's useful for me just as an exercise to take my many random ideas and be like, can I put them into a basic 3-act structure, even if the final book doesn't resemble that? So anyway, so that can help a little bit, take the mysterious random bits and help organize them.
Hey, hey, Mike,
Hey, it's Deepam.
I'll take on the burden of asking some of these questions to you so we
Sure.
can have that interactivity here. One person asks, are there any cliches in writing suspense that you would avoid?
There are probably many. Yeah, there's just like in any genre or in literary fiction, there's good writing and less good writing, right? And given the caveat that there's taste and subjectivity and all that, but you know, I don't personally, I don't a stream of one sentence paragraphs with tons of italics is a turnoff for me, but often it's not the short paragraphs that's the problem. It's what the words are that make up those short paragraphs. So I think I don't think it's genre specific. I think it's prepackaged phrases, and I think one thing that makes effective writing personally is the big moments can be understated and the small moments can be overstated, to kind of keep us unsettled. And so when the big moments are using these giant crazy word to be like, remind me with a frying pan just how big it is, and I'm like, I don't need that. It's a big moment, you can just kind of tell it. So I think for me sometimes it's like just overdoing it in every way, from word to syntax to formatting.
On the subject of surprise, which is one of the buzzwords that somebody mentioned earlier, you and I have talked about the twist ending as a kind of cliche, and sometimes that's overused or done really clumsily, right?
Yeah, the ending, and especially people who pick up mysteries, you don't want to figure it out, right? You want to know that you could have figured it out, so it has to be fair play, but you don't want to have figured it out. And in thrillers, my sort of rough definition between the difference between a mystery and a thriller is typically a mystery you're trying to solve and the crime has already happened. In a thriller, it's like you're in the moment trying to stop something or prevent something or get out of a situation or something like that. But I think for both of those, we want to be a little behind the story. We don't want to feel like we've got it all figured out. And it was funny though, because when I wrote The 3-Day Affair, none of this occurred to me. And so sometimes readers would be like, oh, I guess the ending. And I'd be like, good, that's awesome. I'm so happy for you. I wasn't trying to have you not figure out the ending. That's wonderful. And then I started to realize that kind of reader didn't want that, right? And so honestly, Bluff was the first novel where I knew, because it was like a con artist magic kind of book, I knew that readers they wanted to be along for the game. So that one I sort of consciously wrote in a way that's like, you ain't figuring this out. You were not going to figure it. And so I was a little more conscious about it. But the first time around, I was like, that's so wonderful. I'm so happy that you were along for the ride and guessed it. You're like, great, but apparently that was bad of me.
This is actually a very good question to ask you, Mike. How to create trust between author and reader, because I think in all three of your novels, there's a very clear sense that you're in the hands of an author who is fashioning something that they can see the whole structure of. So you have that trust. How do you establish that trust?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think a lot of it has to do with point of view and voice. And I know that for the stories I write too, but especially for the novels, I spend an awful lot of time and false starts trying to get the voice. And it might take 50 pages to figure it out. And I feel like, is it a conversational voice? Is it more of a third person, authorial voice? But I think that the trust has so much to do with the voice, because the voice of the story also knows the whole story, right? And only reveals what needs to be revealed in the order it needs to be revealed. And it's like, because the authorial presence, even if that's a first person narrator, knows the whole deal, Now that does mean that I have to know the whole deal. So some writers, there's like the planners and the pantsers, right? And some people will plan out everything very elaborately and before they write the book, and some people will go by feel from chapter one and just start going. And I'm kind of in the middle. Like, again, I was talking about the screenwriting stuff. I like knowing the basic architecture of it. It may only be a 2-page outline, but I know like what the basic beginning, middle, end is, because otherwise I don't know how I write the first page, right? Because I feel like the first page is leading me to the last page, and if I don't know what the last moves are in the story, it's hard for me to write the beginning. So I think for me, and again, this is different for every writer, but I think for me, this idea of creating trust is because I do know the bigger picture, right? And I'm trying to dish it out in a way that will be like, listen, reader, this is going to be kind of nuts. Let's start here. So I think that has to. I think it has to do with, but I think so much that's point of view, and its voice.
Yeah, Questlove talks about the difference between planning and the roll with it spontaneity, and how we're all some blend of those two things in creating.
Yeah, and talking to writers who don't do any kind of outlining, it turns out that they do. It's just in their head. Right? It might not be committed to paper, but it's not like someone sits down and says, I'm going to write a novel, and just like, boom, starts writing a novel. I mean, there's that thought, that thinking that goes on ahead of time might not be as a computer file or on note cards, but it's still floating around their head. So I'm not sure that the continuum of like planning or not planning is all that different. It might just be the method of jotting it down so you don't forget.
I was thinking of your mention of the movie Rocky, how 70s filmmaking allowed for these kind of quiet moments, whereas modern filmmaking is pretty fast paced and doesn't necessarily have all those moments of repose. Mm-hmm. Do you think then they lose the quality of suspense, or are they doing other things that are creating that suspense in modern filmmaking? I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around this, because it's something I've noticed for a long time, the difference between like pre and post Star Wars filmmaking. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love 70s movies, but I think in a way maybe that's what's taking its place is like the long form, like, prestige TV right now, like the 8-episode, like that might allow for it in a way that Marvel movie adaptation doesn't do, right?
Yeah.
So that could be, right? It could be that those moments are now happening more in television than in movies.
Yeah. Also with the Rocky reference, you talked about it being an instance of delay, but is there something about the fact that it's this quiet domestic scene that raises the stakes, or is it just any delay will do? You know what I mean?
I think I love that scene because it does so many things at the same time, right? Like, it is delaying the big fight scene. It's cementing the domestic relationship. It's lasering in on what he considers victory to me. Like, it's doing all these things at once. It's really intimate. It takes place in his room, which we've seen before, but not with her in it. Like, it's doing all these great things. But what's funny though is I think that having the scene in a way is more important than what's in the scene. I think having this quiet moment, although it was preceded by him walking around quietly and looking in the arena and everything. So there are a couple quiet moments that precede that quiet moment, but I think having it's the key.
Yeah. Last thing I wanted to ask is about the relationship of magic and writing suspense that you were sort of touching on. I guess I just wanted you to elaborate on that because it's an interesting thing. I know you've written about that before. So is there more do you think you can say to that?
I think that misdirection might be the key word. And again, like, I don't mean that in a cheap way, but magic doesn't work without it, right? Does it work without it? Maybe it does. It depends on what kind of trick you're doing, right? You might need to use misdirection, or you might just need to be so skilled that you can have somebody looking at your hand and you can make the thing disappear anyway, right? So in writing, there's certain writers that are so technically amazing that maybe they just do the thing. I don't know. But I think from plot perspective, and I guess if we're talking about suspense, which we are, I do think that there's this bit of like, I'm showing you this, but not for the reason you think I'm showing it. This idea of like, again, like introduce it. Oh, I'm so generous. I'm telling you this thing, but really I'm making you ask a question about something else, right? So it's kind of like doing two things at once, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. And especially in Bluff, I mean, without giving too much away, you need to sort of actively be following this one possibility before the real thing that's going on is being revealed, right?
Yeah, and I do think that's one thing about more in that book than the other ones, is that I'm almost like writing two books at the same time. Because there's the real story, there's a story that the main character thinks is the real story, I guess three, and then there's the story that I want the reader to, the path that I want them to be along with, which is not exactly either one of those. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Great.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. And thanks again to our evening sponsor, Skylark Bookshop. I want to say the winner of the complimentary copy of Michael Cardos' novel is Megan Martin. So, Megan, just send your name and address to mail@unboundbookfestival.com, and you'll receive a free book. So, yeah, please go ahead and jump on that. And on February 18th at 7 p.m., we'll be back with Mask On, Mask Off, about characters revealing their truest selves, featuring Dean Atta and Elizabeth Lim. So thanks again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you so much. Congratulations, Megan. Thank you, Fang. And thank you for the festival.